¿Cómo? No, usted arranque.
Is this mine that's making all the sound?
I think so.
Mine? No. Como si fuera aire.
¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo les va? Tengan todos ustedes muy, pero muy buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a todos y a todas a la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de nuestra Universidad Nacional de La Plata. Vamos a dar comienzo a la conferencia Estrategias para el desarrollo económico en un escenario internacional incierto. Van a disertar Martín Guzmán, ex ministro de Economía de la República Argentina, profesor de la Universidad Nacional de La Plata, profesor de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, copresidente de Columbia University. Además nos acompaña Mariana Mazzucato, ella es profesora de University College London, autora de Mission Economy. Les recibimos con un fuerte aplauso. Y Joseph Stiglitz, profesor de Columbia University, Premio Nobel de Economía. Nos acompaña también, y le agradecemos, a Carolina Millán Ronchetti, de Argentina, Bureau Chef, Bloomberg News. Queremos agradecer a todos y a todas vuestra participación, a quienes se encuentran aquí presentes y a quienes también lo están haciendo por streaming. A continuación damos comienzo a la conferencia escuchando las palabras de nuestro decano, el magíster Eduardo de Giusti.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos, señor presidente de la Universidad Nacional de La Plata, señores profesores extraordinarios de la facultad, señores exdecanos, señores consejeros directivos, señores representantes de las organizaciones vivas de la ciudad, presidente del Consejo Profesional de Ciencias Económicas, autoridades de la Caja del Consejo Profesional de Ciencias Económicas de la Provincia de Buenos Aires, a cada uno de ustedes y fundamentalmente al panel que tenemos acá presente. Hoy tengo el honor y la responsabilidad de abrir esta actividad de tanta trascendencia para nuestra institución, entendiendo una de las más significativas de estos tiempos y de esta gestión. Y sinceramente quiero agradecerles a todos y cada uno de los que lo hicieron posibles. A Martín, en cabeza de toda esta organización, Por supuesto, a los expositores, para nosotros es un verdadero honor tenerlos en nuestra aula magna. Y también déjenme agradecerle a cada uno de los colaboradores, tanto del equipo de Martín Guzmán como del equipo de la facultad, que estuvo trabajando día y día para que nos salga lo mejor posible. A todos y cada uno de ellos, muchísimas gracias por estar presente y por dedicarse con tanto amor y empeño a la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas. La tradición de este momento, además de agradecer a los expositores y considerando el nivel y la relevancia internacional de cada uno de ellos, es presentar nuestra institución, la Facultad de Económicas, de la Universidad Nacional de La Plata. Y hay muchas formas de presentarla. Martín la conoce. Yo prefiero contarles quiénes somos, qué hacemos y cómo lo hacemos. Y nosotros decimos que somos la facultad que se compromete con la gestión de la educación pública. Y hoy la presencia de su presidente, el presidente de la Universidad Nacional de La Plata, así lo demuestra. También somos la institución que le da valor a la institucionalidad y a la continuidad. Y a cada exdecano que estoy presente, a cada profesor extraordinario que nos viene a acompañar, nos sigue demostrando lo que es la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas y el valor que le damos a la institucionalidad y a la continuidad. También somos la institución del cogobierno, y ahí están nuestros consejeros directivos, de todos los claustros, estando presentes en esta actividad. Esa es la importancia que le damos institucionalmente a este evento. También somos la institución que se compromete con el proceso educativo, con dar clases, siempre, con abrir las puertas, como me enseñaron a mí. La Facultad de Ciencias Económicas siempre tiene que sostener el proceso educativo. Y si hacía falta alguna muestra, nos pasó una pandemia. Y a la semana, todo este cuerpo de profesores, acompañado por todos y cada uno de los estudiantes, acompañado por la militancia estudiantil, acompañado por los trabajadores no docentes, a la semana estaba sosteniendo el proceso educativo de manera no presencial, como pudimos, como aprendimos, pero con la convicción que no podíamos dejar de dar clases. Esa es la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas. También es la facultad que se compromete con los temas de investigación y extensión de importancia para la sociedad. Tenemos investigaciones en género, en pobreza, en distribución, en desarrollo local, en educación, en federalismo fiscal. Esa es la facultad que se compromete con los grandes temas que le acometen a la Argentina. Es una institución que es reconocida por sus graduados y su actuación en el sector privado. Es una institución que es reconocida por el graduado y el compromiso que tienen en el ámbito público. Solo por recordar los últimos años, ministros a nivel nacional como Dante Sica, como Remes Lenikov, como Martín Guzmán, siempre pusieron todo su empeño para colaborar en la función pública. Una institución que es reconocida por sus investigadores, que se reflejan en los premios CONEX, que poseen docentes de nuestra facultad como Alberto Porto y Leo Gasparini. Una facultad que tiene orgulloso entre sus docentes el premio Housei, en cabeza de Alberto Porto. Una facultad que tiene miembros en la Academia Nacional de Economía y en la Academia Nacional de Geografía. Esa es nuestra casa, esos son nuestros valores, así lo hacemos. Sean ustedes muy bienvenidos a la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad Nacional de La Plata. Y gracias por venir a compartir este panel con nosotros, por su generosidad de compartir su verdad, por venir a exponer su visión de los problemas, pero fundamentalmente para hacernos crecer, para hacernos pensar en cómo podemos compartir el conocimiento para transformar la sociedad, que es el verdadero objetivo de una universidad, generar conocimiento para transformar la sociedad. Al fin y al cabo, gracias por su presencia, es un honor para mí este momento y a disfrutar de este panel. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Eduardo. Eduardo de Giusti, nuestro decano. Va a ser la moderadora, como les decía, Carolina Millán Ronchetti, de Argentina, Bureau Chef de Bloomberg News.
Muy buenas tardes y muchísimas gracias a la Universidad Nacional de La Plata por la invitación. Antes de que escuchemos las reflexiones de nuestros invitados, quería profundizar con la trayectoria de cada uno, así que empiezo por aquí. Primero les presento a Joseph Stiglitz, economista estadounidense y profesor de Columbia University. Recibió el Premio Nobel de Economía en 2001 y es copresidente de la Iniciativa para el Diálogo sobre Políticas Públicas en la Universidad de Columbia. También fue economista jefe del Banco Mundial y presidente del Consejo de Asesores Económicos del presidente Bill Clinton. En el otro extremo nos acompaña Mariana Mazzucato, profesora de Economía, de la Innovación y Valor Público y directora fundadora del Instituto para la Innovación y el Propósito Público de la University College London. Es ganadora de múltiples premios, incluidos el Premio New Statesman de Economía Política de 2014, el Premio Hans Matthofer 2015, el Premio Leontief para el avance de las fronteras del pensamiento económico de 2018, entre otros. El día de mañana va a presentar un informe sobre cambio transformacional en América Latina y el Caribe en el marco de las reuniones del CEPAL. Y finalmente nos acompaña Martín Guzmán, quien fue Ministro de Economía de la República Argentina hasta el 4 de julio de este año. Es economista de Brown University y la Universidad Nacional de La Plata, profesor titular en la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas en la Universidad Nacional de La Plata y profesor asociado en la Universidad de Buenos Aires. También es investigador de la Escuela de Negocios de Columbia University y copreside junto a Joseph Stiglitz el Initiative for Policy Dialogue. Ahora los invito a empezar su exposición.
Okay.
Joseph?
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. This is a particularly interesting moment in global history. The world is facing multiple crises. The intellectual framework through which we look at the economy is changing very rapidly, and the geopolitics, the relationships between the West and China and Russia are changing dramatically. So I can't go over the whole landscape, but what I want to talk about is what are some of these changes and what are the implications for a country like Argentina? So first let me begin by talking about the multiple crises. Some people refer to this as the polycrises. We have a climate crisis, an inequality crisis. We're just getting over a pandemic. And epidemiologists say we should be aware that we are likely to have another pandemic. Now we also have Russia's aggression in Ukraine, leading to high energy prices, high food prices. Argentina gets some benefit, but Argentine people pay some cost. And all of these on the heel of a global financial crisis in 2008, the deepest downturn in 75 years. For those economists who were taught about equilibrium models, this is a world of disequilibrium. You just think of how many crises we've had in 14 years. It's really a short time with a lot of crises. And I haven't even mentioned the crisis of Trump in the United States. I'll come to that. On top of all these crises, there are a set of looming crises. Inflation is leading to central banks to raise interest rates, here in Argentina to exorbitant levels. This is leading to a global slowdown, an unnecessary slowdown. The central banks around the world are resolved to create a recession. Never before have I seen central banks so committed to doing damage. We also that will contribute to an impending debt crisis. The IMF, World Bank, UNCTAD all have talked about how many countries in the dozens that will have a debt crisis. And over the medium term, we have the further problem that AI and related changes in technology have raised a host of new problems, from privacy, misinformation, not just imperfect information, and looming unemployment. And the problems I've described are really global. They manifest themselves in different ways in developed and developing countries, But every country is facing these. And just to give you one example, the United States was experiencing declining life expectancies even before the pandemic. Now, it wasn't like we didn't know how to make people live longer. Some of the best research goes on in the United States. But our inequality crisis and the failures of our public health care system have meant that even before the pandemic, life expectancy was on the decline. And just to give you some flavor of the degree of inequality in the United States, the life expectancy today of the average Native American is lower than in any country in the Western Hemisphere other than Haiti. So this is a really failure of, it's a manifestation of inequality, and I'll come to later, it's a failure of our economic model. All these crises are having major consequences. And one that concerns me a great deal is that we have a crisis in democracy. With the growth of authoritarianism around the world, a majority of people around the world live in authoritarian governments today. And unfortunately, even the authoritarian governments are becoming more authoritarian. And there's a crisis of confidence in our institution and in the market economy, in the capitalist system. And some of the key doctrines that have guided policies for decades, including those related to financialization and globalization, and this in turn has political consequences. For Latin America, one of the big things that this reflects, or should give rise to, is the set of ideas that was so influential for 40 years, Chicago School of Economics, sometimes called neoliberalism, should be dead. But ideas die slowly, so there are still some people, maybe some in this room, who still believe in those ideas. And I hope by the end of the lecture I may have persuaded you otherwise. Neoliberalism, these ideas of free market economics, have been the dominant doctrine for 40 years. And that doctrine claimed that those set of policies would lead to higher economic growth. And then there was another idea related to it called trickle-down economics, that higher growth would benefit everybody in society. Well, we've had 40 years of an experiment, a very costly experiment. 40 years is a long time. Remember, the modern economy, you know, the Industrial Revolution is only about 240 years, 250 years. So 40 years is a very large fraction of the modern era. And we know the results. Growth after 1980 was slower. Most of the benefits of that growth went to the people at the very top. People at the middle throughout the world saw their income stagnate. People at the bottom actually saw their income decline. One number that always resonates with me is that the income at the bottom, the real wages adjusted for inflation, in the United States today are the same as they were 65 years ago. So people at the bottom have gotten no pay raise in more than a half century, for 65 years. And an economic system that delivers no pay raise over 65 years is a failed one. what has happened is life expectancy has gone down and incomes have not gone up. Now, there are many elements of this neoliberal doctrine. At the core of it was that markets would solve problems, leave it to the market. Ronald Reagan was liked to say, government is the problem, not the solution. And a lot of people came to believe it. There was an emphasis on liberalization, privatization, deregulation. Companies were told they should just maximize shareholder value. Don't worry about the environment. Don't worry about your customers. Don't worry about your communities. Just maximize shareholder value. Well, the failures that I described have come as a shock to neoliberalism. They thought, as I said before, that it was going to lead to more growth. It didn't. One of the interesting aspects of it is that while they presented these ideas as a philosophy, as an economic philosophy, there were actually many intellectual inconsistencies. For instance, they said, the financial sector particularly said, leave it to the market. Until in 2008, they needed the largest bailout in the history of the planet. And when I remember very distinctly, because I was on some of the phone calls about what they should do when the market collapsed in September of 2008. And one of the phone calls, the Bush administration proposed a $700 billion bailout. And the question from the bankers was, why only $700 billion? I don't know if you know, $700 billion, US dollars, is a lot of money. So, just so, and the answer was, well, don't worry, if you need $1 trillion, we'll give it to you, but we didn't want to have too big of a sticker price. So we'll begin small at $700 billion, but as you need more money, it's there when you want it. It also wasn't about deregulation. It was about rewriting the regulations to benefit the financial sector, as an example. So, for instance, one of the regulations concerned if you go bankrupt, and companies go bankrupt all the time, who gets paid first? When nobody was looking, the bankers got Congress to write the law so that if there was a bankruptcy, the derivatives, those risky products that nobody fully understands, got paid before anybody else. Well, that was an industrial policy. It was a policy that encouraged derivatives. It was a policy that encouraged instability. And a policy that led to the financial crisis. Similarly, it wasn't really about trade liberalization. It was never about free trade. You hear a lot about free trade all the time. Free trade is good for growth and all that. If free trade was the issue, trade agreements would be very short. I take away my tariffs, you take away yours. I take away my subsidies, you take away yours. They would be about 3 pages long. If any of you see a so-called free trade agreement, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages. Why? They're not free trade agreements, they're managed trade agreements. The US will never take away its subsidies to agriculture. The US will never allow free trade of Argentinian beef into the United States or Brazilian crops. So the basic line is, it's not about free trade. It's free trade for us, but not for you. And there are many other examples that I could give. The intellectual property rules were the worst part of this because they were rules embedded in the free trade agreements that were designed to enhance the profits of drug companies like Pfizer. And the investment agreements that were also embedded in the free trade agreements weren't about protecting against expropriation, as they pretended. They were about protecting against regulation. And what's interesting right now is that even in Europe, one of the key investment agreements, they're all repealing because they recognize they won't be able to deal with climate change unless they repeal that. So the bottom line that I want to emphasize is the 40-year experiment with neoliberalism should be over everywhere in the world. And it's led not only to low growth, unequal growth, but instability. It's been a disaster for the planet. The market has not even shown itself to be resilient. And one of the things that I find just so amazing, in the middle of the pandemic, America wound up with a shortage of baby formula. Now, making baby formula is not that complicated. It's not rocket science. But if you went to a store in the United States, the shelves were empty like they were in the Soviet Union in its dying days. A very simple reason: we had allowed the concentration of market power to be so great that one company had 50% of the market of baby formula. And when that company was exposed to have unsafe, unhealthy working places, factories, they shut it down and we had a shortage. I could go through lots of other examples, but one of the big lessons of all this is that we've seen that our market economy is not resilient. So that leads to what other lessons have come out of the pandemic. One of them is reinforcing this lesson about lack of resilience. We couldn't produce even face masks or protective gear. But the pandemic also showed that we needed a large role for government. If it hadn't been for government, we would not have had the vaccines. If we hadn't been for the government, our economy would be in a depression. It was economic. We were saved by the economic intervention of the government. We were lucky that we were a rich country, and government spending was 25% of GDP. And we just spent the money. It didn't cause the inflation. I maybe get ahead of the story, but we were lucky, and it meant that our economic downturn was the least of the countries that were affected. Our poor healthcare system meant that more than 1 million Americans died. So it was disaster from a health point of view, but from an economic point of view, we were all able to go. And the same thing was true about countries around the world. Governments protected health, protected the economy. And in those countries where there was strong trust in government, like New Zealand, they responded strongly in ways that meant that the incidence of the disease was very limited. So out of this picture, what I want to say is that we have all these crises. They've exposed the failures of the neoliberal model, and that should lead us today to rethink where we ought to be going. And you know, if this were a more academic seminar, I would go into what were the key assumptions that went into that model, why were they led so astray, assumptions about perfect rationality, perfect information, perfect competition, There's a whole litany. It's a whole body, each one of which was a bad assumption. And you put together, we have an expression called GIGO, garbage in and garbage out. If you make bad assumptions, you're going to get bad conclusions that don't describe. And the neoliberal model was based on a very large number of assumptions that amazingly, as part of the sociology of knowledge, which is something that people ought to spend more time on, was bought by people all over the world and was sold by people like Milton Friedman. And there's an interesting question, well, why were Chicago boys so successful in Latin America? I think that's an interesting question that you might want to discuss. But it should be clear that this was a set of ideas that should have been questioned from the very beginning. Now, the interesting thing from my point of view is that my own research, focusing on imperfect information and imperfect markets, risk markets, showed in the 1970s, before neoliberalism grew, that all the conclusions of neoliberalism were wrong. So Milton Friedman, when he was selling to Latin America, and the Chicago boys were selling to Latin America neoliberalism, he knew that those results were wrong. Economic science had shown that markets were not, in general, efficient. I had shown in my own work that the reason, Adam Smith wrote this most influential idea that the pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. And one of the results that I put of my research was that the reason that the invisible hand was invisible was it wasn't there. And the market, if we look around all the failures I just described, it should have been obvious that the market was not this wonderful nirvana. But people acted as if it were. So what was so interesting is that theoretically and empirically, even before Chicago sold Latin America on these ideas, they had been shown to be wrong. It was an act of dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty, to promote certain kinds of ideas. So let me just conclude in a few minutes and say, what is the alternative? What is the other set of ideas? And I've tried to advocate, the words I use to describe it is progressive capitalism. Some people said that's an oxymoron. The basic idea that I want to emphasize is in a large economy, in a modern economy, you have to decentralize. You can't have control. So you have to have markets, you have to have some, but they have to be regulated. They have to work with government, with civil society, with other forms of institutions like universities, nonprofits. The strongest universities in America, among the strongest, are neither for-profit. The only for-profit university, was symbolic of the for-profit university, is Trump University, which excelled in one thing, being able to fleece ordinary people and take advantage of them and their aspirations. So the notion is you need a rich ecology of institutions working together with strong regulations, progressive taxation, progressive expenditures, policies like industrial policies, and Mariana will probably talk about that. Markets on their own don't restructure the economy in ways that you need as you go from in the process of development, and as even the United States, interesting, and this goes to the idea of the end of neoliberalism, the US just passed an enormous public infrastructure bill, no private public partnership. It was basically a public infrastructure bill and a massive industrial policy bill called the CHIPS Act. We realized the market was unable to produce the chips that we needed to be resilient. And so we passed a $250 billion, that's a lot of, again, a bill to help move the economy. Markets don't make these kinds of transitions to a green economy, to this kind of structural transformation on their own. And some of my own research has explained why markets don't work, but the bottom line I want to emphasize here is it's unambiguously clear that they don't, and so that's why you need this broader framework which recognizes both the strengths of markets but also their limitations and how they have to work within other institutions in society. Just one more final comment that I'll make. If we reflect back on the question, why do we have higher standards of living today than we did 250 years ago? It's not, you know, for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years, standards of living were unchanged. There is data that, you know, not great data, but going back, and we can look at real wages, measures of standard of living. No changes until about 1750, 1800. And what happened then? Life expectancies grew, standards of living grew, and in my interpretation, it was because of a set of ideas called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had two basic ideas. One, the importance of science, and the other one is the importance of mechanisms of social organization, that we could work together. In simple farms, you didn't need complex systems of organization, but to make a modern, you know, even a product like mRNA, the research is a complex. So the basis of our higher standards of living were the whole progress was science and social organization. And science and social organization are both based on notions of being able to tell the truth, seeking knowledge, being able to arrive at what we mean by knowledge. Universities are at the center of that. And, you know, we take these Enlightenment values and Enlightenment principles sometimes for granted. In the United States, we've had a president who simply does not understand, not the current president, let me make it clear, the previous president, who does not understand any of these principles. And in that sense, not only is it disturbing to the global economy, it is putting at risk our democracy and even our standards of living and the progress that we've had for 250 years. So one should understand how much is at stake in the moment that we are. It's a perilous moment, and we have to respond to the crises. We have to recognize that the old ideas didn't work, but there are a set of ideas that I think can enable us to continue to raise standards of living in an equitable way.
Muchas gracias, Joe, por estas reflexiones. Ahora le doy la palabra a Mariana para que nos comparta su forma de abordar estas temáticas.
Muchas gracias. Y podría hablarle en español, pero es mejor que no. O podemos votar. Mejor que no. Pero es un grande placer estar aquí, sobre todo con todas esas caras bonitas y esperamos que después, bueno, podemos hablar, no podemos hablar, ¿verdad? No hay questions. Entonces, nada, no van a hablar, solamente nosotros. Sí, claro. Okay, so I'll continue in English. Just to say, the last time I was in Argentina, I had to apologize to the United Nations because I had been brought by CEPAL, and we're here also for the CEPAL conference. That was today, the summit. And as part of the visit, I was brought to the house of Macri. And I sat down on a beautiful sofa, the one we sat down last night. Joe and I went to the President Fernandez's house. We spoke, and then afterwards, I went to the airport. And you know when you have a glass of wine and then your brain kind of gets a bit foggy and then you go on Twitter, which you should never do. And I tweeted, wonderful to have met President Macri. We spoke about the futility of neoliberal policies and the need for investment-led growth, period. Not sure he got it, period. And then I had another glass of wine, looked at the time, and then I looked at Twitter. It was like 10,000 retweets. So this time I'm being much more careful with Twitter. My children always say, Mom, think before you tweet. Anyway, so I think it'll be a very nice conversation here because where I'd like to begin is I think, you know, most people, at least intelligent people in this room, know markets fail. Is this on? Good. But I think we need to go beyond that. I think we need to go beyond the theory of the state and the theory of the public sector and the theory of policy, political economy, beyond the state fixing market failures, no? Because otherwise, by design, not by accident, by design, you're always too little, too late, literally out of breath. Whether you have to think about big tech, sustainable growth and climate change, COVID, all these different crises that are overlapping, the financial crisis, the climate crisis, the COVID crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the water crisis, there's all these crises. So if each time within each of those you're fixing a market failure, you will always, first of all, need a big luggage of bandages. How do you say bandages? Cerotti in Italian. Bandas. Yeah, anyway. You will always be bandaging up the system. And again, by design, because that's what it says, fixing market failures. You are a fixer. And all the language around market failure theory in terms of how it then falls on the practical stuff is about fixing. And you're always also, how it's described in terms of the narrative and the story of the state, and so the people who work inside the state, is incredibly boring. You know, if you are a really smart undergraduate or a graduate student coming out of a great university like this one, do you prefer to be a de-risker or a risk taker? Do you prefer to be leveling the playing field or playing in the playing field? Do you prefer to be an investor of first resort or a lender of last resort? It's literally by design making people fall asleep to think about the bureaucracy. And even the concept of bureaucracy. There's no reason the word bureaucracy should be a negative word. We all use it as a negative word, right? Oh, it's so bureaucratic, it's Kafkian. The problem is we have the wrong bureaucracies. We have slow, inertial, vertical, not flexible, not agile bureaucracies. There's nothing inevitable in that. And I think I want to just pause a bit on this word inevitable because first of all, what I'll speak about in the time I have is about a different framework, which I'll call market shaping and co-creation. So the co-creation and the co-shaping of markets is very different from the market failure fixing of markets. But also, you know, this word inevitable is important because all these crises make us think that it's almost something inevitable, deterministic out there, whether it's again, probably not people in this room, but even things like, you know, digitalization will be labor displacing. Not necessarily. And I'll come back to that, but not necessarily. And so the fact that we need a different framework, I think, needs to start with first principles. And the first principle is that the market is an outcome. there's not a market pressure out there forcing companies to do stupid things like share buybacks. The market, so-called market, is an outcome of how we organize business, which is not the same thing as the market. That's the biggest mistake business schools make sometimes, confusing the market with business. So the market is an outcome of how we organize corporate governance, how we organize the governance of the state, market fixing, market shaping, all sorts of different governance structures within the state, how they relate one to another. Do they relate together parasitically, symbiotically, mutualistically? What is the deal between these public-private actors, which I'll come back to again later. But the nature of the deal, the nature of the relationship, the ecosystem, if we want to sound sexy, determines the market outcomes we have. So that's, I think, a really important point. And if you haven't read Karl Polanyi, the great book, The Great Transformation, that's a really good historical account of this point. He says, you know, we would have never had the market, the so-called free market, had there not been a huge amount of state intervention. It was actually state intervention that led to the so-called free market. And this, by the way, is where I differ from Sandel, Michael Sandel, because his point, I'll say it stupidly, but his point, and maybe, and I'm sure you know, you probably know him very well, is that we shouldn't actually be bringing into the market certain things that should stay out of the market, right? All sorts of issues, especially that have to do with ethics, for example. But that, I think, accepts this mainstream view of the market as simply kind of an area where business operates. You could actually, by thinking ambitiously about how to steer markets to deliver very different types of outcomes and steer the economy itself, which is an outcome of all those different things I just mentioned, to achieve certain goals, and assuming that the state is here or public policy is here, and the market is there driven by business, which it can be regulated, and fixing market failures when it goes wrong, but some things just shouldn't enter there, I don't think upsets or debunks enough the mainstream view of what the market is in the first place. And as Joe mentioned, Adam Smith, I'll just say the most ununderstood economist after Keynes, I think Keynes was also misunderstood, was Adam Smith. Not only because he also wrote this great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, but the theory of the market and the free market in Adam Smith is not free from the state, it's free from rent. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx, the classical political economists, actually had a very strong theory of rent, different from profits. And if you read Adam Smith carefully, when he's talking about what he meant by free market, I personally think it's much closer to a theory of being free from rent than free from the state, which is how the Adam Smithian scholars who advised Liz Truss to reduce tax to the level that the whole government has again fallen apart have never read Adam Smith properly. Anyway, so market shaping and market creating, I think, requires 4 different things that I wanted to talk about. One is a very different education of the civil service itself. And I'm here with 2 people, Luca and Manuel, who came for me from London, who actually took a master's in public administration that my institute teaches, which was all about, is all about rethinking what do we mean by value, what do we mean by creative bureaucracies or the bureaucracy, what do we mean by purpose orientation and market shaping and not just market fixing, and what is a kind of design thinking also in terms of long-term planning approach that's needed in terms of shaping and co-creating markets. And so I'll say something maybe quickly about the education system, because I think that's one of the things that continues to propagate this problematic notion of markets. Another thing is, how do we design policies in a market shaping way? What's the difference between a market fixing and a market shaping policy? And then I'll say something quickly about the new kinds of institutions that we need, how to redesign institutions like public banks, but also the tools, everyday boring tools like procurement policy, which I've become las compras públicas, which is an amazing lever that can be used precisely to avoid the baby formula problem. In fact, it was the Korean War in the US that convinced the United States government to have the Defense Production Procurement Act, which is like focused on what are the outcomes we need and how can we use procurement government purchasing to get there is one of the key levers working alongside the private sector. And then I want to say also something about why all of this actually requires a different view of public-private partnership, but where that word is a provocative, difficult word, where we actually question what does a symbiotic partnership look like in terms of the conditions that should be embedded in everything the state does, whether it's guarantees, whether it's bailouts, and you mentioned the big bailouts. You know, Goldman Sachs was bailed out, just one company, by $10 billion. And 1 year after the crisis, the financial crisis, Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, said at a dinner party, Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. And he wasn't trying to make people laugh. So the fact that a bank that was bailed out by 10 billion had a CEO that still presented this value creation machinery and talked about it as a productive entity just shows how badly we also measure productivity. Because in some ways he's right. If you confuse value with price, and if you have workers within Goldman Sachs earning a huge amount of money, and we are confusing. The opposite problem, of course, is with school teachers, where we pay them very little and also then value them very little. But the fact that we're paying billions to people that create derivatives and hedge funds and so on, and then confuse value with price, actually then allows him to say such a crazy thing with a straight face, not trying to make people laugh. Anyway, so what I was saying was, bailouts, procurement, grants, loans, all of these things can actually have embedded within them a contract between the public and the private sector. So it's a true deal. It's a true deal. So I'll say something about that. So first, in terms of the education, I'll say very little about each of these points because we don't have so much time. It's very interesting to look around the world, and I'd be curious if it's true here, the way that we talk about government policy. It's not only about fixing markets, but also the training. Literally, the tools are designed through a theory of public choice theory, which then in the management schools is presented as new public management. And if you read between the lines, there's really no theory of the state there. It's almost trying to make the state have an ambition to reach the kind of efficiency levels of the private sector. So on the one hand, there's a very clear distinction what the state should do and what business should do. Business is, in the market system. Every now and then it fails. The state comes in and fixes the problem. But the worry is always that if it fixes too much, if it takes up too much space, it will crowd out the private sector, right? So in fact, it's really interesting, and I keep going between theory and practice here, but the tools then that the state has, like procurement that I mentioned, are often done in fear. Literally in fear. So in Italy, where I'm from, procurement is done, and we call it appalto, the appalti, is done in an agency called l'Agenzia Nazionale dell'Anticorruzione, ANAC, A-N-A-C. So you have procurement, which could be used in an incredibly ambitious way, in a creative way, if you have creative bureaucracies, done in an agency that is worried. It's like, oh, let's not do too much, right? Because we're going to get corrupted. There's nepotism, there's corruption, there's crowding out. So I come back to the point, by design, you will fail, okay? So of course corruption matters, and again, I'm from Italy, so we sold corruption and the mafia, that's our biggest export, so I know corruption exists, but the best way, I think, to beat corruption is to actually have a proper theory of what the state is for, right? Because then you can hold it accountable. It's not about big state, small state. So one of the things we try to do in our education platform in the institute I run is to really also have a research, a body of work that's trying to push the theory of the state precisely around the kind of metrics that you would need if you're actively shaping and creating markets, not just fixing them, but also co-creating value, and concepts like public value, no? El valor público. What is it? What's public value? Sounds good. What's the public good? It sounds good. But the public good, if you look at the theory of the public good, it's correcting for something the private sector is not doing. You're filling the gap, right? Basic research, R&D, there's not enough of it because it's hard to appropriate the returns. So the private sector doesn't invest enough in it. So the state invests in basic research. Not enough. We know we should have more research and development spending, but this idea that the state is there to fill the gap because the private sector is not doing enough of it in areas like defense spending, clean water, R&D, and so on. Again, by design, you're in filling up mode. Public value and public purpose and the common good, which is a word that the Pope uses. I'm in trouble with the Pope because I was telling Joe I got an award this week from the Vatican, and then Vatican people found out, oh, she's pro-abortion. So there's a big, on Twitter, a big scandal that a pro-abortion atheist won a Is it on before? Now it's on. See, when I said it wasn't on, it wasn't on. That's crazy. Has anyone heard anything I said? I have to start trusting men less. I ask them questions and they, yeah, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine.
¿No estaba on?
No, te lo dije que no estaba.
Yo creo que fui yo que prendí el...
Era la primera cosa que le pregunté. ¿Es on o es off?
30 seconds ago, I turned mine on. I think I turned yours off. That's what happened.
No, pero now I hear myself. Okay, and it doesn't matter. It's these guys. They don't know how to... I'm kidding. Joke. I don't remember what I was saying. Anyway, sorry. So the public good is a correction. The common good is an objective. Okay? I've been working... This is amazing. I really hear myself now. I don't even have to yell. The BBC is an organization in the public sector. It's a public broadcasting service. And I've been working with them to unpick this notion of public value. Because unlike any public institution I know, they actually have that metric. And it holds them accountable. But what's interesting is they are much more ambitious than like other public broadcasting services who have bought into the idea that they're there to fix a market. Public broadcasting service in the US. They do nice documentaries, nice high quality news, but of course they don't do the things that are for business. Why? Because they would be crowding out business. The BBC has never bought into the bullshit of market failure theory. They've said, independent of the format, literally the TV format, we will invest, but we will be ambitious. We will create a new type of soap opera, a new type of talk show, a new type of high quality news and documentaries. Of course they make documentaries. But the talk shows and the soap operas are interesting because in theory it's for business. Why? Because you can also make a lot of money in those, easier than documentaries. In doing so, they pushed the frontier of what a documentary is. They pushed the frontier of talk shows and soap operas. So EastEnders, not Dallas and Dynasty. No one here knows what I just said, right? You don't know EastEnders? Do you know Dallas and Dynasty? Anyway, Dallas and Dynasty were these old-fashioned American soap operas of the rich and famous, like in Mexico, La Mentira. In Colombia, they told me Café. What do you have here? A good soap opera. He's too smart. He doesn't watch them. Telenovelas. You guys are, no one here watches telenovelas. You're terrible. Anyway, so the BBC made telenovelas with working class people, with the first black people on the soap operas. They pushed literally the design, and in so doing, they crowded in business, crowded in. They created a new landscape to play, to make profits. Same thing in documentaries, same thing in talk shows. And this is interesting because then they use it to hold themselves accountable. If they just make stupid soap operas and talk shows and high quality news and documentaries where there's no real value, that's not very good for the state because this is public money. And so we help them unpick what is public value for them. And we came up with a very interesting framing, which you can find on Google. Just Google BBC public value and my name, you'll find it. And we broke it down into individual value. Is the program actually nice or not? And they have some metrics for that. Do people like it? Forget that for a minute. Social value, fighting against things like fake news, and industry value, precisely by being ambitious and creating a new market, the degree to which that actually helped crowd in and create a new area for business to play in. They also, by the way, formed very nice contracts with business. They didn't just sell off their intellectual property rights, but that's another point. Anyway, so another thing, policy design. So one of the interesting things with market shaping is it means you have to be really ambitious. So the recent book I wrote called Mission Economy begins with a speech by Kennedy of we're going to do it because it's hard, not because it's easy, no? To go to the moon. All the language in the policy world is about facilitating, making things easier. The opposite of what Kennedy said would need to happen to go to the moon. We're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. So if you look at then how they did it and how they designed the public-private relationship and how they designed the organizational structure of the bureaucracy of the state inside NASA, also in DARPA, it was to embrace uncertainty, embrace risk-taking, embrace experimentation. Why? Because it's hard to go to the moon. It's hard to fight climate change. It's hard to reduce the digital divide. It's hard to actually build and create the medicines that we need, but especially to strengthen our health systems. Is this just about facilitating and de-risking someone else? Or is it about shaping markets and embracing that uncertainty? So in the book Mission Economy, I look at what does it mean to embrace the uncertainty around moonshots, missions, around the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll just quickly say that the kind of framing, I'll go a bit longer because he went much longer, just a bit, is you begin with the challenges, the desafíos, retos. I still don't understand the difference. Desafíos o retos, ¿es la misma cosa? Desafíos. You begin with the challenges. Did I just eat a fly? I hope not. Turn them into moonshots that are clear. The problem with the Sustainable Development Goals is they stayed at the challenge level. No one turned them into moonshots, right? So a moonshot is making something really clear. Did you get there or not? But broad enough to involve lots of different sectors. So any moonshot around climate change is not just about renewable energy, but for example, would require new materials, new transport systems, new food. Just like going to the moon and back in a short amount of time, which was the mission, required not just aerospace, but also nutrition, materials, electronics, and software. So the intersectoral, not sectoral, intersectoral collaboration, the collective intelligence that you need to shape markets with the state leading in terms of setting the vision, setting the mission, but keeping very open the how, otherwise that's micromanaging and that'll kill innovation, is a moonshot approach. But the hardest thing is what comes next. How do you redesign the tools, grants, loans, bailouts, guarantees, and subsidies to really foster that bottom-up experimentation towards the public goal? So again, whether it's procurement, but also conditions set with public loans, right? If you have a bank like BNDES in Brazil, or CAF, the more regional public bank around here, what does it mean to create a loan program where the role of a public bank with public purpose and public value metrics is not just giving out money, subsidies, guarantees, loans to industry that's in trouble, that needs help, but actually to help transform that industry, those firms, because you're giving them a public loan. So in Germany, for example, the KfW, the public bank, has recently provided loans to the steel sector, acero, in condition that the sector reduces its material content, which then they did because they had to, otherwise no money. So they did it through repurpose, recycle, reuse technology throughout the whole supply chain. Germany today has the greenest steel sector in the world because of the conditions set on the loan. And you know, Joe talked about intellectual property rights. Those are not rights from God, those are contracts. You get 20-year monopoly profits from the state when you get a patent. Where's the deal? The deal should be that those patents remain narrow, not too wide, simply used for strategic reasons, that they are not too strong, so easy to license, and they are not so upstream in the innovation process, so we're actually privatizing the tools for research. That would be the condition, it should be the structure of the intellectual property rights system in order for the state to get back its share of the deal. right? So this idea of deal making, I think, is really, really important in a mission-oriented approach. And there's no reason to have a deal if you don't know what you're even trying to do, where you're trying to go, what is the direction of the economy. So that directionality of growth, not just the rate of growth, is critical to talk about through vision setting, challenges, sustainable development goals, missions, but then that should actually be structuring the design of all those different tools. And another type of conditionality, of course, is about reinvesting profits. Joe talked about Pfizer, which not only abuses intellectual property rights, but it's also one of the biggest share buybackers in the world. Over 6 trillion, that's 12 zeros, dollars, have been used by the global 500, Fortune 500 companies just to buy back their own shares, to boost stock prices, to boost stock options, to boost executive pay. Pfizer is the second biggest share buybacker in the world after Exxon. That's a lack of reinvestment. So you could also, in these deals between public and private, have conditions that the profits being generated from a collective system, because Pfizer benefits from the $42 billion a year that the state puts into the health innovation system, the condition could be that the profits being generated from this collective investment at least get reinvested back in the system and not just siphoned out as dividends and share buybacks. That, by the way, it's interesting, the CHIPS Act, I'm trying to help inform the Secretary of Commerce on this in the US. The CHIPS Act today, which is about $259 billion, does have a proviso that the money, but it's just so obvious, it's incredible they have to say it, cannot be used just for share buybacks. There's a bit of also conditionality on working conditions. There's nothing on green. But anyway, we're working with them to really form a very ambitious CHIPS Act, which is a true deal and not just a giveaway. And lastly, just to say, you know, because my time is definitely up, all of this in terms of that public-private deal is truly about rethinking the social contract. And I believe that this kind of market-shaping approach, market-creating approach, which uses things like missions to design industrial strategy, that then determines these conditions at the center of these contracts between public and private, is the best way to fight inequality. Because what it means is that you're fighting inequality ex ante, not ex post. What is often called in a pre-distributive way, not just redistributive. And there's a great Latin American economist, Gabriel Palma, who has a Palma ratio, which if you look at the proportions of different incomes that he looks at, he's basically looking at the hollowing out of the middle class, right? So the 10% and the bottom 20% and the ratios between them as giving us insights on the extraction machine, which has allowed such a small percentage of the value creating system to extract what is truly, in the end, socially created wealth. He says there's so much money wasted by governments. He literally looks at the money across different countries, wasted just to pick up the mess in that kind of market failure fixing language that I talked about before, but in this case, in terms of inequality. By allowing the business models to be wrong, by not getting the right conditions in the first place, we then create inequality that then governments need to waste so much time and energy and imagination to fix in a redistributive way. And of course we all believe in redistribution. Of course we want progressive taxation, for example. But you would hope that governments could use most of their imagination, time, and energy on the what's to be done, right? And to really go after those difficult goals, the earthly moonshots, and not just spend so much time correcting for the failures, also income failures that come up after. So these ideas of really creating bold conditionality in terms of conditions on reinvestment, conditions on better working conditions, conditions on better pay, because what we know is that real wages have not been increasing with productivity, conditions on reinvestment, condition on the direction of manufacturing to make sure it's green. Steel and cement can be green, right? It's not just about renewable energy. All of this is about not only steering growth, but getting the conditions right ex ante in a pre-distributive way. I could say more, but my time is up. but I hope that was interesting insights on why we need to rethink the state from first principles in order to get better policy. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Mariana. Martín.
I'll turn you off.
No.
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 Ahí está.
Mío, sí.
El tuyo sí. Ahí está, perfecto. Bueno, buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Es por supuesto un enorme placer estar en mi facultad, en mi alma mater, la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad de La Plata. Y quiero comenzar por agradecerles, Carolina, yo, a Mariana, la presencia de ustedes, y lo hablo también desde un punto de vista institucional. Nuestra casa de estudios nos honra, han estado pensando por muchos años en la frontera del conocimiento sobre desarrollo económico, y es para nosotros muy valioso que nos acompañen a discutir estos temas que son tan importantes para nuestro país, para nuestra región, para el mundo en general. Agradecerle también a las autoridades de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas y de la Universidad de La Plata, estudiantes presentes, profesores presentes, veo algunos aquí, hola Leo, Jorge, y también a la Young Scholars Initiative, que estuvo organizando un esquema de becas para estudiantes de todo el país que hoy nos pueden acompañar. Sé que me informaron que hubo más de 1.500 inscriptos para la charla y que hay gente en 2 salas, digo bien, contiguas, viendo este panel por video. Así que bueno, lamentamos que la sala no tenga espacio para 1.500 personas, pero también les agradecemos mucho el acompañamiento, y después de este panel vamos a tener la oportunidad de, junto a los estudiantes, estar en una sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Aquí, por supuesto, que estamos hablando de futuro, y yo quiero comenzar por una definición que es de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de desarrollo económico. Y aquello a lo que apuntamos cuando hablamos de desarrollo económico es a una idea de progreso compartido, de progreso colectivo. ¿Sí? Que la economía de mercado funcione de una manera tal que permita que el colectivo pueda desarrollar su potencial. Es decir, la pregunta que nos ocupa es cómo construir una economía de mercado que redunde en una estructura económica, una estructura productiva que satisfaga un conjunto de condiciones clave. Primero, que incluya sobre la base de generación de trabajo con equidad. Segundo, que sea dinámica desde el punto de vista productivo, algo que tanto el profesor Stiglitz como la profesora Mariana Mazzucato ponían en el centro de sus presentaciones. ¿Qué rol se le da a la política pública, de lo cual vamos a estar hablando, para alcanzar ese dinamismo productivo? De hecho, con redistribuir no alcanza. Con redistribuir no alcanza, y el dinamismo productivo es muy importante. Tercero, cómo lograr que esa estructura venga acompañada de condiciones de estabilidad, tal que no vivamos con las ansiedades y las angustias que las inestabilidades económicas generan en nuestro país. Históricamente han sido parte del patrón de desarrollo de nuestra economía. Muchos crecimos, todos en esta sala crecimos en una economía que históricamente ha tenido muchas dificultades de definir una tendencia, un rumbo preciso, y sabemos que eso tiene implicancias para el desarrollo humano. Cuarto, y esto pasa en las repúblicas que son federales, poder repartir esas oportunidades que se genera a lo largo de todo el territorio. Y quinto, que podamos ser los dueños o dueñas de nuestro propio destino. Para todo Estado-nación, la soberanía es un principio fundamental de cualquier proceso de desarrollo económico. Y desde el espacio que nosotros ocupamos, tanto en estas aulas como cuando nos toca hacer política pública, nos toca preguntarnos y definir qué rol juega el Estado y qué rol juega la política pública para alcanzar estas condiciones que definen un proceso de desarrollo económico. ¿Qué rol juega el Estado y la política pública desde la definición de reglas y las estructuras institucionales en las cuales se dan las dinámicas de poder? ¿Qué rol juega el Estado de forma directa en la política pública? Y aquí hay una cuestión muy importante a definir, que es qué rol puede jugar el Estado en la construcción de lo que nosotros los economistas llamamos ventajas comparativas dinámicas. Y el mundo de hoy no es el mundo del siglo XIX, el mundo en el cual muchos de los ejemplos del libro de texto que nosotros hemos estudiado en estas aulas, por ejemplo, se enmarcan. Un mundo distinto en el cual los factores de producción eran mucho menos móviles. El capital, el trabajo, eran mucho menos móviles que lo que hoy vemos. Entonces, a la hora de construir ventajas comparativas, es importante definir qué es aquello que no se puede mover fácilmente de un país a otro, de un Estado-nación a otro. Y de esa forma, cómo construir abundancia relativa en aquello que no es móvil. Bueno, hoy los países en el mundo logran construir ventajas comparativas dinámicas, generando abundancia relativa en el capital público estratégico y algo que también se ha hablado, tanto yo como Mariana lo definieron con claridad, el conocimiento, crear sociedades capaces de generar conocimiento y de aplicar el conocimiento a la producción. Es decir, Joe tiene un libro que se llama Creando sociedades que aprenden. ¿Cómo se logra desde la política pública impulsar las condiciones para crear sociedades que aprenden? Y lo que eso implica para el rol del Estado es definir aquellos recursos que generalmente son escasos con los que cuenta el Estado, o sea, son limitados, no hay recursos infinitos, cómo se invierten desde la política pública, cómo darle un perfil a la economía de mercado que permita tener mayor dinamismo. Mariana hablaba del Estado orientado a misiones, una cuestión importante a la hora de definir cualquier rumbo del desarrollo económico. Y el Estado protegiendo cuestiones que el mercado por sí solo jamás va a resolver bien. La salud, la educación, la seguridad social, algo fundamental en el desarrollo de las sociedades en nuestra región, en todo nuestro continente. Hemos vivido procesos que han dado lugar a muy fuerte exclusión social. En algún sentido, las sociedades tomaron un riesgo, a veces con dictaduras, a veces bajo democracia. Y esos riesgos se materializaron. Hubo millones de personas que quedaron excluidas de los mercados de trabajo. ¿Y después quién se hace cargo de eso? Bueno, como el colectivo se debe hacer cargo de eso. Y el rol de la seguridad social en ese aspecto también es muy importante. A la hora de pensar el rol del Estado en la política pública, hay que entender que la estabilidad macroeconómica es una condición fundamental para el desarrollo económico. De hecho, hoy en la Argentina, una de las políticas de Estado que más valdrían, cuando se habla de reformas, una de las reformas que más valdrían es un fuerte, decidido compromiso de mediano plazo con las políticas consistentes desde lo macroeconómico que ayuden a que tengamos un ambiente de mayor estabilidad macroeconómica. Todo Estado-nación tiene entre sus pilares para el desarrollo su propio crédito y su propia moneda. Es muy importante fortalecer el crédito propio y la moneda propia. Y eso requiere encarar un camino que permita fortalecer al propio Estado. El fortalecimiento del propio Estado es una condición necesaria para que el Estado pueda cumplir su rol, pero también para que el ambiente en el cual el sector privado toma sus decisiones sea un ambiente en donde haya condiciones que den lugar a mayor toma de riesgos, a el tipo de innovación con el Estado jugando el rol que aquí se ha definido que una economía de mercado necesita. Una economía de mercado, por supuesto, que debe apuntar a condiciones de mayor competencia, y por eso es tan importante el rol que el Estado juega con respecto a esa cuestión. Y hay un concepto que muchas veces parece trillado, pero es importante que no se trille, que es justamente hablar de políticas de Estado. Las políticas de Estado son muy importantes, y en nuestra región han escaseado las políticas de Estado, y a veces es difícil lograr construir políticas de Estado, porque no hay que perder de vista que tanto la definición como la implementación de las políticas públicas funcionan en un marco de dinámicas de poder. ¿Sí? La economía también es una ciencia política. Las relaciones económicas no ocurren en un vacío, y la definición e implementación de las políticas públicas tampoco ocurre en un vacío, ocurre en un esquema de marcos de dinámicas de poder. Y es fundamental, nosotros cuando estudiamos economía, que entendamos las dinámicas de poder. Para entender bien el funcionamiento de una economía, es imposible separar a la economía de entender la política y las dinámicas políticas. Por eso digo que la economía también es una ciencia política. Hay veces que toca, por lo difícil que es la coordinación social, definir reglas para que sea más difícil que no se lleven adelante ciertas políticas que deberían ser políticas de Estado. Yo quiero mencionar dos ejemplos que se dieron bajo el periodo en el cual yo fui ministro de Economía de la Argentina, que son, primero, la Ley de Financiamiento de la Ciencia y la Tecnología. Para nosotros esto era muy importante. Construir sociedades que aprenden requiere también sociedades que invierten en el desarrollo científico y tecnológico. Y esa ley ha sido respetada en los últimos 2 años, implica que la participación del presupuesto de la ciencia y la tecnología en el producto tiene que converger a un punto del Producto Interno Bruto en el año 2032. ¿Sí? Se establece un camino que hace que la ciencia, o se busca, y esto es importante respetarlo, que la ciencia y el desarrollo tecnológico en la Argentina sean políticas de Estado. O sea, el sector privado por sí solo no va a invertir en ciencia. Hay enormes cantidades de derrames que el privado de ningún modo va a internalizar, y el rol del Estado es absolutamente central en esa dinámica. Claro que todas estas, cuando uno define un esquema de política fiscal, es fundamental entender que hay restricciones. Aquí en estas aulas estamos horas y horas estudiando las restricciones de presupuesto. ¿Sí? De la nada, nada viene, y no es que no hay límites. O sea, hay que tener una racionalidad, hay que actuar con cierta seriedad, entendiendo que, dado que hay un límite a los recursos, bueno, se define qué es lo que más vale a la hora de empujar un proceso de desarrollo con agregación de valor. La segunda ley que me parece importante resaltar, que habla de una idea también que debería ser política de Estado en la Argentina, es la Ley de Fortalecimiento de la Sostenibilidad de las Deudas Públicas en Moneda Extranjera. Esto tiene que ver con el hecho de que la sostenibilidad de las deudas debe ser una política de Estado. Cualquier sociedad que queda aplastada por una carga de deuda a la que no puede hacer frente, debilita al Estado, debilita a toda su situación macroeconómica, genera desasosiego a nivel social. Hace muchísimo daño, y la evidencia es abrumadora sobre el daño que hacen los procesos de endeudamiento insostenible. Esto fue una situación interesante y novedosa la que se dio a la hora de presentar un proyecto de ley que nos limitaba a nosotros mismos. Lo que implicaba es que en el futuro cualquier gobierno que quiera tomar decisiones de endeudamiento en moneda extranjera, bajo ley extranjera, o tener un programa con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, tendrá que ir al Congreso, como lo hicimos nosotros cuando yo estaba en el Ministerio de Economía en el actual año, para refinanciar el endeudamiento histórico, récord histórico con el Fondo Monetario Internacional que la Argentina tomó entre el año 2018 y el 2019. ¿Sí? Ya no puede pasar, en la medida que esa ley, que hay que defenderla, que la sociedad tiene que defender, no se cambie, que un gobierno de turno pueda generar cantidades masivas de endeudamiento en moneda extranjera con todo lo que ello implica. Ahora, uno puede definir una visión que aquí tanto Mariana como yo lo han hecho con mucha claridad. Ahora, el siguiente paso es tener la capacidad de aplicarla, ¿sí? desde el Estado que tengamos la capacidad de aplicar aquella visión que definimos. Esto, en primer lugar, requiere que haya cierta capacidad fiscal y capacidad macroeconómica. Y cualquier movimiento político que apunte, que venga con una bandera de aquí hay una estrategia de desarrollo económico y definimos este rol para el Estado, tiene que respetar el hecho de construir las condiciones si no están, o respetar las condiciones si están, para que el Estado tenga esa capacidad fiscal y macromonetaria necesaria para llevarlo adelante. Y lo segundo, algo que también Mariana en varias ocasiones definió en esta charla y que es parte de aquello que ella ha llevado adelante desde sus investigaciones, es la capacidad del Estado para ejecutar. Y se ha dañado mucho a los Estados. Este es un problema global, un problema también en nuestra región y un problema en nuestro país. Los Estados están dañados. Y sí, efectivamente, el proceso que yo llamo el neoliberalismo ha generado muchísimo daño a las capacidades de los Estados y a las capacidades con las que cuentan los propios funcionarios para llevar adelante políticas, pero cuidado con esto, porque el daño a las capacidades de los Estados ha sido un fenómeno transversal a gobiernos de distintos colores. Este no es solamente un tema de derecha, es un tema también de centroizquierdas en nuestro continente. Y quienes consideramos que el Estado debe tener un rol muy importante para generar una economía de mercado con condiciones aptas para el desarrollo económico y social, debemos entender que hay caminos que debilitan a los Estados y hay otros caminos que lo fortalecen, que le permiten construir mayores capacidades. Uno podría adentrarse en ejemplos, pero después tendremos tiempo de poder tener cierta discusión. Pero claramente hay ciertas disyuntivas a la hora de definir cómo se organiza una estructura del Estado. Cada decisión, por ejemplo, de escindir parte del patrimonio de la administración pública del Estado, sacarlo de la administración pública nacional y crear una entidad pública por fuera de la administración pública nacional, es una decisión que implica que los marcos normativos que aplican a la administración pública y la capacidad que tiene el Poder Ejecutivo de forma directa queda afectada. Y es algo que hay que mirar con atención y ciertamente hay que mirar con atención en nuestro país. Decía que estamos viviendo hoy, luego de estas 40 años, 4 décadas de una globalización que no ha funcionado para las mayorías, una era de estados débiles y que este es un fenómeno internacional. Y por lo tanto quiero, como anteúltimo paso en esta ponencia, adentrarme en la situación del contexto internacional en el cual estamos pensando aquí las estrategias para el desarrollo económico en el mundo, en América Latina, en la Argentina. Yo hablaba de 4 décadas en donde dentro de los países, y sobre todo en el hemisferio occidental, ha habido aumentos significativos de la desigualdad, al mismo tiempo que en buenas partes del mundo como que surge una suerte de clase media global, pero se ven situaciones a lo largo de todo el mundo en donde la productividad de las trabajadoras y los trabajadores aumentó fuerte, aumentó mucho, pero sin embargo el salario promedio no siguió la misma tendencia. Hemos visto que los muy ricos se han hecho muchísimos más ricos y que ese crecimiento, ese progreso no ha sido compartido y por lo tanto eso no es desarrollo económico real. Hemos visto un mundo con mucha mayor inestabilidad, muchísimas crisis a lo largo de todo el mundo. Hemos hasta dañado a nuestro planeta, el fenómeno de cambio climático y lo que eso genera para la sustentabilidad futura. Se ha construido una arquitectura tributaria internacional que ha sido conducente al debilitamiento del Estado. De vuelta, ha sido construida por pocos para pocos. Empresas multinacionales, grandísimas empresas multinacionales. A mí algo que me impactaba también en mi tarea de Ministro de Economía es la fuerza relativa de las grandes empresas mundiales en relación a los Estados. Y empresas multinacionales que se han beneficiado de una arquitectura tributaria internacional construida a propósito para la ilusión de impuestos y lo que eso implica a la hora de tener las condiciones para financiar las políticas públicas que necesitamos. Ni hablar de la arquitectura financiera global. Argentina ha tenido que lidiar, bueno, a mí me ha tocado por supuesto lidiar con eso en primera persona, marcos que son funcionales a los intereses de quienes más han ganado, desde el sistema financiero internacional y también lo que se describía sobre el esquema de patentes, derechos de propiedad intelectual. Veníamos transitando ese mundo y pasaron dos cosas muy significativas a efectos de entender en dónde estamos parados hoy. Primero la pandemia y después la guerra en Ucrania. Yo les digo, a mí me tocaba estar en las reuniones del G20 de ministros de finanzas y de bancos centrales. Hay gente en esta sala que también ha estado, de hecho también gracias por la presencia de funcionarios del gobierno nacional. Y el principal tema de preocupación hoy, no solamente para los bancos centrales, sino también para los ministerios de finanzas y economía, es la inflación. Es de lo que todo el mundo habla, de la inflación. Ahora, el profesor Stiglitz les contaba que la forma en que se está respondiendo a este problema global es la típica respuesta de política económica cuando hay un exceso de demanda. Subo la tasa de interés, contraigo la política monetaria. Ahora, pensemos lo siguiente. Y de vuelta, esto que digo es muy importante para pensar el desarrollo económico en nuestra región y en la Argentina. Venimos de un mundo en donde hay mucho malestar, donde la desigualdad ha venido siendo un problema fundamental del desarrollo social. Un mundo en donde además los estados tuvieron que tener en los 3 años recientes un rol muy activo para proteger a las economías, proteger las capacidades productivas, proteger la salud. Y por lo tanto tuvieron que hacer políticas fiscales expansivas. Y muchos, los que pudieron, las financiaron con crédito público. Otros que no teníamos acceso al crédito público, como nos pasaba en la Argentina, tuvimos que recurrir a lo que había, que era la emisión monetaria con las consecuencias que ello conlleva. ¿Okay? Pero lo que pasa hoy en el mundo es que los niveles de endeudamiento global son más altos que hace 3 años. Son significativamente más altos que hace 3 años. Entonces, en ese mundo, en donde los bancos centrales del mundo aumentan las tasas de interés, lo que es esperable, por un lado, es que haya problemas de sostenibilidad de deuda, problemas para refinanciar las deudas de muchos países. Argentina no tiene por unos años que refinanciar sus deudas, pero la Argentina tiene un nivel de endeudamiento en moneda extranjera que claramente es alto por la dinámica que se dio entre el 1 de abril del año 2016 y el año 2019. Los aumentos de las tasas de interés que se están dando en el mundo, por ejemplo, afectan la tasa de interés sobre los préstamos del Fondo Monetario Internacional. La Argentina le debe 45.000 millones de dólares al Fondo Monetario Internacional que se están refinanciando. Lo que esto significa es que no solamente los países van a tener problemas para refinanciar las deudas con los acreedores privados, sino que hasta el costo de financiamiento hoy con los organismos internacionales más relevantes también aumenta. ¿Y qué quiero decir con esto? Quiero decir que cuando uno piensa una estrategia de desarrollo económico, tiene que tener muy claro con qué mundo está lidiando. La política exterior es uno de los puntos de partida más importantes a la hora de pensar el desarrollo económico de una nación. Esto es algo que en la Argentina nos falta mucho, y esto es también transversal a todo el espectro político en la Argentina. No hay la suficiente atención y valoración de política exterior que se debería haber dado la fundamental importancia que ella tiene. Porque eso te define hacia qué perfil productivo vas, qué buscamos con la integración internacional. Y buscamos un perfil productivo favorable, no exponernos a lo peor a lo que uno se puede exponer en el mundo. En el caso de los costos de interés con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, ahí ven un ejemplo muy ilustrativo de a qué mundo uno se expone. Nosotros, les voy a contar una anécdota muy interesante. ¿Sí? Estábamos a principios de la gestión con el staff del Fondo Monetario Internacional en el Ministerio de Economía, en una de las salas, y estábamos analizando el tema de la sostenibilidad de la deuda de Argentina, cuáles eran los distintos costos de interés con los distintos instrumentos. Entonces, obviamente nosotros además, la obsesión académica de cada número, uno calcula la tasa a la cual el FMI esperaba que le esté prestando a la Argentina y ve que difiere de la que efectivamente se venía pagando, que la Argentina venía pagando. y la cuenta daba distinta. Uno calculaba la tasa básica del Fondo Monetario Internacional y la cuenta daba distinto que la tasa que Argentina estaba pagando. Entonces, pregunto, ¿y esto qué? ¿Cómo puede ser esto? Y ahí aparece, o sea, fíjense cómo funciona esto. Ahí aparece un concepto. No, pero hay sobrecargos de interés. ¿Y qué son esos sobrecargos de interés? No, es una tasa extra que se paga cuando un país pide más que la cuota que tiene como accionista en el Fondo Monetario Internacional. Cuando pide suficientemente más que la cuota. ¿Y eso dónde está? ¿Dónde dice en el sitio web que Argentina, que cada uno de los países cuánto está pagando por eso? Fíjense el nivel de opacidad, y ahí se inició toda una campaña, con países enterándose. Me pasó reuniéndome, no voy a decir con quién, una primera ministra de un país. Estoy reunido con ella y le digo, bueno, ustedes habían tenido un desastre natural, un huracán muy fuerte, la economía en situación complicadísima, y estaban pagando sobrecargos de interés al Fondo Monetario Internacional. A ver si se entiende esto. El Fondo Monetario Internacional se supone que no debería financiar su modelo de préstamo cobrándole más a los países que están en crisis. ¿Sí? Y le digo, pero ustedes están pagando sobrecargos. ¿Cómo? ¿Nosotros estamos pagando sobrecargos? Y estaba el representante del Fondo Monetario Internacional en la reunión. Y le pregunta, el representante para ese país, sí, están pagando sobrecargos. Ahora, cuando nosotros tuvimos que lidiar con la geopolítica para ir con esto, así como tantos otros temas, pero este es un buen ejemplo. Ahí ven cómo funciona el poder real a nivel internacional. ¿A qué intereses responde cada quien? De hecho, la mayoría de los países apoyó la modificación de esto y hubo un actor principal que se opuso, pero que es el más poderoso. ¿Y a qué voy con esto? A la hora de cualquier política pública relevante que va a tener consecuencias sobre cómo vivimos todos por mucho tiempo, es clave entender en dónde nos estamos metiendo, a qué nos estamos exponiendo, qué intereses va a representar cada parte a la que quedamos expuestos con las decisiones que se toman. Por eso digo, estamos en una situación en donde claramente hay problemas, pero también hay grandes oportunidades. Y en nuestro país, la situación global actual presenta grandes oportunidades para apuntalar las condiciones de desarrollo. Uno de los grandes temas de los cuales se ha venido hablando es el tema de las oportunidades en el campo energético y cuán transformacional puede ser la aceleración del desarrollo energético en el país para toda nuestra estructura productiva, y podría ir enumerando otras oportunidades que se presentan tanto en la Argentina como en la región, una región que requiere de mayor integración para apuntalar y aprovechar esas oportunidades. En este mundo que hemos descrito, hay una tendencia que se está dando que es peligrosa, que es que hay una creciente base electoral, apoyo electoral, a propuestas que vuelven a viejas recetas del pasado que no han funcionado, que incluyen quitas de derechos sociales que tan importantes han sido para el desarrollo de nuestras sociedades, y eso no va a funcionar. Y aquí no hay eslogans, no hay balas de plata. Pensar el desarrollo económico es algo que no es trivial, y tenemos una responsabilidad de ayornarnos, y de ayornarnos en múltiples dimensiones, no solo pensar las cuestiones económicas, sino pensar las cuestiones políticas, las cuestiones de poder, y pensar bien la política exterior. Quiero cerrar esta parte de la presentación primero celebrando que podamos tener este tipo de encuentro, y la presencia, veo muchas y muchos estudiantes. La juventud es quien construye el futuro, y este tipo de espacio es la base de la construcción del futuro, es la base de la generación de conocimiento, la base de la movilidad social. Bueno, está mi mamá presente. Sabemos que muchos hemos tenido oportunidades gracias a que la educación pública en la Argentina existe, que la universidad pública en la Argentina existe. Y esto es algo que hay que defender con mucha fuerza. Hay que defender y hay que fortalecer. Es una de las principales políticas de Estado que requiere nuestro país, que requiere nuestra región. Así que cuidemos eso, que es muy importante. Yo creo fervorosamente en la Argentina. Seguiremos trabajando para construir el mejor futuro posible para nuestro país. Celebro que lo pensemos juntos y agradezco muy especialmente al profesor Joseph Stiglitz y a la profesora Mariana Mazzucato por ayudarnos en esa tarea. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias a los tres. Me rescato cómo los tres, cada uno apunta al momento de cambio de paradigma en el que estamos, ¿no? Y sobre todo algo que decía el profesor Joe Stiglitz, de como momento de repensar muchas de las suposiciones con las que se trabaja como economistas y en la política pública también. Varias de las preguntas que voy a hacer van a volver sobre este concepto. Joe, quería volver al final de tu exposición, donde hablabas de la importancia de la centralización para alcanzar este capitalismo progresivo. ¿Cómo ves, cómo se puede avanzar en esta idea de la centralización en un contexto en donde pasan dos cosas? Una de más corto plazo tal vez, que es las subas de tasas de interés de los bancos centrales, que son independientes del Ejecutivo, y otra de más mediano plazo, que se ve no solo en Argentina ni en Latinoamérica, sino en todo el mundo hoy en día, que es la polarización.
One of the things that, is it working? Yeah. If I understand your question right, one of the things, when I talked about decentralization, in a complex economy, you have to have different units doing different things. The idea of central planning, which was the old Soviet Union, never worked. You could never get all the requisite information. So you have to decentralize in some way into smaller units. But the essential issue in an organization of a complex society is how do you create rules within the organizations and how the organizations relate with each other. And this actually interacts with what Mariana talked about. You know, a lot of the vocabulary talks about markets demand this or markets expect that. But markets don't exist in a vacuum. Markets are shaped. And that was really what Mariana's message, that we have to think about, it's not only markets get shaped, the economy gets shaped. And that shaping is part of the public process. You know, part of the public debate is how do we shape our entire society and how do we shape the economy? And that's where, you know, my, you know, observation of the complexity of various societies is that you need this variety, which will differ from time to time and place to place. Again, well, let me try to add to what Mariana said in this, that the way that much of the public debate has been framed over the last 40 years is to give primacy to markets, as if God had said the market is the basic solution, and then you go back and you try to fix. Markets have a little problem here and a little problem there, and you call a plumber in and to fix the problems when you see them. And the real problem is with the architecture and how you design system. And, so for instance, one of the things that I've talked a lot about in some of my books is the public option. That I'll talk about this from the American point of view. The private health insurance system is very inefficient. And yet, the discourse in the United States was to try to stop the government having a health insurance system. And so one of the ways politically that I've advocated this is to say, look, we won't force everybody to go into the public sector, but we'll give them that option. And if the government is more efficient, it may be many institutional reasons why it may be better. Universities have been done, public universities are so much better in most countries, but not all, than for-profit universities. So if we find a niche where they work, let them work. Let them compete with the private sector. So another example is our public retirement program, we call it Social Security, their transaction costs, the efficiency is so much greater than any private insurance company, any private annuity. And so let's allow people to put more money into the public social security system if they want to save more. So think about that as a public option. America's mortgage system, private mortgage system, fell apart, believe it or not. I mean, you all know it fell apart in 2008 when we had the financial crisis. But believe it or not, 14 years later, the government is still running the mortgage system. The private sector, every time the government says, let's get the private sector to run a mortgage system, the private sector says, but you'll have to give us subsidies. And the government says, no, we don't want to give you subsidies. And then they say, well, we can't function without subsidies. And so that's the way the debate has been going. So the presumption that has been so strong over the last 40 years that the private sector is the solution is clearly wrong at this point. And that's where we need, and so we need decentralization, but we need to think about how in each of the different sectors we can get different mixes. And in some countries, the National Health Service in the UK worked very well until the conservative governments over the last 20 years, tried to defund it. And if you take away all the money, it's not going to function that well. I don't know if that fully answered your question, but let me try.
Después volvemos a estos puntos. Mariano, un poco trajiste a tu charla el ejemplo de el Reino Unido. Las últimas semanas estuvo en todos los titulares alrededor del mundo. Y estuvimos viendo, estamos en un momento en el que tenemos situaciones, como en el caso del Reino Unido, donde aparecen inversores, los que en inglés se llaman bond vigilantes, ¿no? Que venden deuda soberana cuando no están de acuerdo con las políticas del gobierno. Y al mismo tiempo vemos que los bancos centrales están subiendo las tasas de interés y ponen presión bajo los gobiernos. En este ambiente difícil para los ejecutivos, ¿cómo pueden los gobiernos de economías emergentes preparar planes de desarrollo como el que mencionas en este tipo de ambiente? A ver. No.
Remember which language I was speaking. So, one thing that I don't think people have said that's happened in the United Kingdom, so think of it as a thought experiment. What would the market have done? Is it on?
I think so, but I don't dare to say that anymore.
What Liz Truss had said was, we're going to reduce taxation for the rich, because then it's going to trickle down to the poor, which we all know doesn't work. But what if she had then said also, we're going to engage in a massive austerity program in order to pay for it. Would the market have reacted as it did? And I think not. In other words, the market didn't react because they know trickle-down economics doesn't work. The market reacted because there was not going to be anything to pay for it. Now, we know that austerity after the financial crisis in the United Kingdom was a massive failure. Even the World Bank, I don't think it's on. Is it on? It's talking. Didn't work, right? So the UK, unlike the United States actually had a massive stimulus program. It could have been bigger. I think it should have been bigger. But they had 800 billion in fiscal kind of stimulus program after the financial crisis. They tried, by the way, to direct it towards the green economy. There's even a book called the New New Deal, the Green New Deal. That's why they set up all sorts of also guaranteed loan schemes to Tesla and Solyndra. They set up ARPA-E, like DARPA, but for energy. The United Kingdom and Europe, after the financial crisis, did austerity, which didn't work in places like Italy and Spain, which were forced to cut their public expenditure in order to receive what at the time was the European recovery, saw their debt to GDP actually rise, right? Because they reduced their deficit. Spain actually reduced its public funding of research and development by 40% to stick to the deficit ratios. And what happened was the obvious, but it's not obvious, I guess, for the economists, that they weren't then investing through the public budget all the things that we need: education, research and development, training programs, so on and so forth. So productivity fell even further, and the denominator didn't rise. So even with a mild deficit, the denominator is growing at zero. The ratio, in theory, can go to infinity. That lesson wasn't learned. We're about to embark again on austerity programs globally. But what's interesting with the UK is that the way the media talked about it, and even the way some educated people talked about it, was like, oh, the market finally punished the stupid stuff, right? It's not just left-wing intellectuals saying, don't do the Reaganite, Thatcherite tax cuts, it doesn't work, it just increases inequality. That's not what the market did. The market just knew that it was unfundable because it doesn't work, but it wasn't a just kind of ethical reaction. In fact, I am sure that if they had said, we will cover it, because we know it's not going to really trickle down with massive austerity, we would not have had this reaction against it. I mean, obviously there was other political instabilities in the UK that mainly come from Brexit. After Brexit, the market for UK investment fell massively. What drives business investment is the expectations of future market opportunities and technological opportunities. With Brexit, that was reduced. So there was a fall in business investment in an economy that's already overly financialized. Most of finance in the UK goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate, fire. A lot of the business models are very short-termist, very kind of extractive in the ways I was saying before. That just got worse with Brexit. So since Brexit, there's been this desperation to attract capital through deals. There's the Nissan deal, all these backroom opaque deals to try to get capital to come back with promises of little tax, little regulation. And in fact, what Truss did, it wasn't just low tax. She said, we will make it harder to go on strike, so labor union bashing. We will deregulate. We will set up enterprise zones, literally like the 1980s enterprise zones, and this massive tax cut. So the whole package was crazy, right? But it was the tax bit that made the markets really worry about in terms of the public expenditure, and Joe last night was telling us about the whole pension market, which was going to collapse and so on. But in terms of, I mentioned today in the CEPAL meeting, one of the leaders who was really talking about this for the developing world, which is the pressure, besides Martin, the pressures coming from financial markets that are really strangling in some ways public budgets, versus the narrative of what just happened in the UK of, the market reacted because somehow this was a stupid policy, is Mia Motley in Barbados. And she's not only talking about why we need a new financial architecture that actually allows developing countries to have budgets through different schemes to tackle the biggest priorities of our time: climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and being prepared for the next pandemic. But also the hypocrisy that we have the developed world which industrialized by creating massive pollution, which the developing world is facing the consequences of, at the same time that the developed world's institutions, like the World Bank and IMF, are strangling the ability, through these problematic conditionalities of the past, the same ones that Europe did for Italy, the IMF and the World Bank have been doing for developing countries, but then, close down the fiscal space that was required. So I think, what we need is a much more granular understanding of just how problematic these market reactions are, which strangle the ability of the countries to actually release the funds. But one of the things I also spoke about today in CEPAL at the meeting was that even if that was not the case, one of the things we need is public sector capacity to implement policies, public administrative capacity. And what I was trying to say in my presentation is I think there's been a dismantling of that capacity. So even, again, coming back to Italy, when the money comes to Italy from the European Union, now with the recovery program, but also before with structural funds, there's no proper implementation capacity to spend it. They actually have to give back money. Italy has been giving back money to the European Union, European Commission, for some years because of the lack of public sector capacity. And that has been done, I believe, on purpose. This outsourcing trend, it's not just privatization, but massive outsourcing of public sector capacity is something we need to be extremely aware of, because even if countries like Argentina have all the money in the world, if we don't rebuild the state bottom up, there's not much to do with that, with those funds.
3 or 4 very brief points. First is, what happened in the UK reminds us of something that people in the developing worlds have always said, that the market has really restricted the space of autonomy. And here you have the UK. We thought was a major country, maybe not anymore, but they used to say that the sun never set on the British Empire. It tried, the market rebelled at a very small change in the budget. It was just the cutting of the tax at the top that caused the thing to tilt over. So that's the first point, that even advanced countries have had, with globalization, their autonomy constrained. The second point is that it exposed the hidden risk of under-regulated financial markets. Nobody knew that the pension funds were so much at risk. And it was the collapse of the pension funds that really brought the government down. No one in the United States knows what hidden risks are there with the sudden and rapid increase in interest rates. So we don't know. There may be further tremors in any country around the world. And the third important point is just to reiterate that we're going through right now this, all the countries in the world, developing countries particularly, emerging markets, this very narrow corridor, what Martin described. Maybe you want to talk about that for a second? Yeah.
Yeah, but I connected to, la voy a conectar a la pregunta que Carolina me haga y voy a retomar ese tema.
Yeah.
Adelante.
Me acaban de decir que estamos bastante atrasados en el cerrando. Voy a hacer 2 preguntas muy breves a Martín antes de que cerremos. Hay que ir
Y además,
dando al final, pero así que las dos son muy breves y con gusto puedes conectar a lo que hablábamos recién. La primera, para aprovechar por ahí, los que estén viendo en video no saben que casi todo el auditorio son estudiantes, ¿no? Y Martín, vos estudiaste acá, sos de acá, pasaste por el mundo académico, por la función pública, ahora de vuelta al académico. Quería pedirte una reflexión para los estudiantes que estén pensando en cómo tener el máximo impacto. Esa muy breve. Y la segunda que te quería hacer, ya que vos trajiste el tema de la sostenibilidad de la deuda, por ahí muchos aquí hayan aprendido que uno de los objetivos suele ser retomar el acceso a los mercados, ¿no? ¿Qué pensás vos de esa suposición en el contexto, por ejemplo, de la renegociación de Argentina, pero de las que vengan, como decía Joe, en este contexto incierto donde van a venir muchas más?
Gracias, Carolina. Bueno, tenemos dos preguntas y un comentario chiquito sobre el punto que Joe Stiglitz marcaba. Primero, déjame arrancar por la segunda pregunta, así después vamos al mensaje a los estudiantes. Tema deudas. Obviamente que este es un tema internacional, es un tema que abarca a lo que conocemos como el sur global del mundo. Estamos viendo en estos momentos más y más países que entran en situaciones en donde es inevitable tener que reestructurar las deudas, y lo que ha venido pasando en las últimas 4 décadas aproximadamente, cuando los países tienen crisis de deuda, no es demasiado alentador. Nosotros lo llamábamos el fenómeno del too little and too late, demasiado poco y demasiado tarde. Cuando los países ingresan en situaciones de crisis de deuda, tardan demasiado en iniciar los procesos de reestructuración de deuda, y una vez que lo hacen, generalmente el alivio que obtienen no es el suficiente como para salir del problema en el que están. Y esto tiene que ver con cómo funciona el sistema. Los dos lados del sistema, o sea, el lado de los acreedores y también el lado de los deudores. Del lado de los acreedores, primero que hay un poder desproporcionado en favor de estos grandes acreedores que cobran una tasa de interés muy alta, con un premio por si las cosas van mal, lo que se llama premio al riesgo, pero cuando la cosa viene mal te dicen no, igual toca pagar, y se hacen muy difíciles en el marco actual internacional. Esa negociación es un tema muy estudiado en la literatura, de mucho valor en este momento para mirar. Del lado de los deudores también hay problemas. Los deudores son parte del problema en el sentido de que hay significativos problemas de lo que llamamos el political economy, el tema de poder, cómo el poder internamente primero no tiene los incentivos casi ningún gobierno tiene los incentivos a decir, bueno, sí, yo arranco la reestructuración. Algo muy diferente de lo que nosotros hicimos, que desde el primer día dijimos que esto había que hacerlo. Y segundo, también es muy común encontrar vínculos muy directos entre la base acreedora de un país y quienes están en el poder político. ¿Sí? Hay mucho lobby interno. La tarea de un negociador nunca es sencilla, no solamente por lo externo, sino también por lo interno. Por lo tanto, no van a ser fáciles estos fenómenos. En el caso de Argentina, la Argentina, por supuesto que tiene un problema de endeudamiento, tiene deuda con el sector privado internacional y deuda con el Fondo Monetario Internacional. La deuda con el sector privado internacional fue reestructurada. Miremos las magnitudes de lo que estamos hablando. O sea, el ahorro para la Argentina de esa reestructuración fue de aproximadamente 35.000 millones de dólares en una década. Imagínense lo que eso implica a la hora del ejercicio de lobby, todos los incentivos que hay para jugar muy fuerte. Y Argentina no tiene vencimientos de capital hasta el 9 de julio del 2024, y recién empiezan en 2025 los volúmenes más grandes. Pero está también la deuda con el Fondo Monetario Internacional. Y el problema de una decisión como la que se tomó en el 2018 es que tiene consecuencias por muchos años, décadas. Afecta a generaciones por décadas. Y no es que vimos al pueblo argentino en ese momento manifestándose frente a un gobierno democrático en la Plaza de Mayo para que eso no ocurra. Este endeudamiento ocurrió bajo un gobierno democrático y va a tener consecuencias. Ahora esa deuda se está refinanciando, pero por supuesto que la carga de deuda que tiene la Argentina con acreedores internacionales es una carga importante con la cual va a haber que lidiar. Segundo, que plantea Joe de esto del corredor finito que tienen los países. Hoy hablábamos de los estados están débiles. Este es un tema muy complicado en el mundo y, por supuesto, en las llamadas economías en desarrollo y emergentes. ¿Querés llevar adelante un esquema de políticas públicas en condiciones de financiamiento muy apretadas y abusar de otras fuentes de financiamiento, como podría ser, por ejemplo, recurrir al financiamiento directo del Banco Central? Obviamente que implica, en una situación de exposición, problemas cambiarios, y eso genera problemas para la macroeconomía, problemas para el sistema productivo. Así que es una tarea imperiosa para los estados recuperar su fortaleza, porque hoy pasa lo que Joe describe. Hay muchas limitaciones y hay un corredor fino por el cual se puede avanzar. En el caso de Argentina nosotros habíamos definido este corredor que era desde el punto de vista fiscal un escenario en el cual el Estado tenía un rol importante para los objetivos de desarrollo económico y la recuperación macroeconómica. Se implementó una política de ese tipo que ayudó a que la Argentina el año pasado crezca 10,4%, que el país genere 1.150.000 puestos de trabajo, la tasa de desempleo baje del 13% al 6,9%. Por supuesto que también con una economía que tuvo que recurrir a una fuente de financiamiento que genera problemas en el frente cambiario y por lo tanto en el frente inflacionario. Lo que no estaría bien es seguir un camino como en otros momentos se ha seguido, que sea desestabilizante del crecimiento económico, porque la verdadera normalización de una economía requiere de una economía que vaya creciendo. Si no, también caen los ingresos fiscales, los problemas de sostenibilidad aumentan, no funciona y la evidencia empírica en este sentido también es muy clara. Y finalmente, sobre la cuestión de la trayectoria que uno ha seguido en la vida y el luego llegar a un espacio de políticas públicas. Una cosa que les digo, sobre todo a los estudiantes, es que ni se imaginan lo muchísimo que vale a la hora de gobernar tener un marco conceptual muy definido, el haber tenido muchísimo entrenamiento formal, académico, a la hora de pensar cómo funciona una economía. Porque piensen que en una posición como la que me tocó estar a mí, toman decisiones todos los días que tienen un altísimo impacto, y no es solamente todos los días, es casi todas las horas, y muy rápido, a veces en minutos. Y es una enorme ayuda sentir la paz que da el entrenamiento académico, formal, el haber pasado por aulas en donde uno, un poco, cada uno nos rompemos la cabeza tratando de entender mejor cómo funciona el mundo. Y no solamente por lo que da de forma directa en cuanto a lo que uno aprende, sino porque nos enseña a aprender. Parte de lo que hace la facultad nos enseña a aprender. Y eso es muy importante a la hora de estar en posiciones que son súper dinámicas, en donde todo el tiempo hay que estar reaccionando a nuevas contingencias. Imagínense la pandemia. Yo asumí como ministro de Economía, muy poco tiempo después, 3 meses después, pandemia. No había crédito. Imagínense lo que es manejar la economía de un país en una situación así, donde la incertidumbre es enorme. Bueno, ahí es donde, país con crisis de deuda, después la guerra en Ucrania, en todas esas situaciones tan dinámicas, todo lo que hayan hecho previamente, todo el esfuerzo que hayan puesto en estas salas, en estas aulas, realmente créanme que va a valer muchísimo. Y además hay una realidad que es, nosotros el instrumento para transformar realidades es la política. Y es muy valioso para el desarrollo de nuestros países que se logre generar cierto encantamiento en la política y que la gente joven sienta esa motivación de decir, yo quiero hacer algo por mi patria. Eso el mundo lo necesita, América Latina lo necesita, la Argentina lo necesita, y desde el punto de vista personal también vale muchísimo. Es algo muy único en cuando uno puede estar en una posición en la cual puede ayudar a su propio país. Así que solo tengo para decirles, si esto les interesa, métanle con ganas.
Bueno, nos hubiera gustado seguir, la verdad, con este panel de lujo, pero muchísimas gracias por su tiempo, a los que se quedaron hasta el final y a la universidad sobre todo.
Muchas gracias, Martín Guzmán, Mariana Mazzucato, Joseph Stilik y por supuesto Carolina Millán Ronchetti, autoridades de la Universidad, de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas, de instituciones públicas y privadas, por la presencia de todos. Muchas gracias.